When we think about who we are, all of us started out from somewhere. And for me, I started out in a Jewish home. I was the only child of a Jewish couple, an older Jewish couple. My dad was 52 years old when I was born, and my mom was 42. And both my parents were Jewish, but they were very different kinds of Jewish. Now, that might seem a little bit odd to some of you who haven't heard this before, but just as being a Christian does not mean one thing, ask Protestants and Catholics if they believe the same thing. Saying that a person's Jewish does not necessarily define what it is that they believe or what they do. Well, in the case of my parents, those were two entirely different sets of ideas of what it meant to be Jewish. My dad's side of the family was Orthodox, and they very seriously kept the tenets of the faith. For them, it was a religion that characterized their lifestyle. They were devout Jews. My mom's side of the family, in contrast, are what would be referred to as Reformed Jewish. And Reformed Jews pretty much do whatever they want to do in terms of their religious beliefs. They really don't have any one set of beliefs that define them. But really, you can think of it more of a cultural identity than a spiritual one. So I grew up in a conservative household, not politically, but in terms of the branches of Judaism. I was raised conservative, which is kind of like Orthodox light. We kept kosher, we adhered to many of the traditions, we had two Passover Seders, fasted on Yom Kippur, but we didn't follow some of the stricter requirements of Orthodox Judaism. For example, we would drive to synagogue on the Sabbath instead of having to walk as the rest of my dad's. So that's my start in terms of spirituality, is I was taught the Jewish faith. And my earliest significant memory about being Jewish was being in the synagogue on one particular holiday, I don't remember which, and they were doing some sort of activity at the front of the synagogue that I didn't understand. And I happened to be seated next to my uncle on this day. And so I leaned over, and I was probably 8 or so years old. I leaned over and I whispered to my uncle, who was an important man in the synagogue, "Uncle, why is it that they're doing that?" And it was quickly apparent to me from his long hesitation that he didn't know the answer. But after that awkward silence, he simply said, "We've always done it that way. It's tradition. Now stop asking so many questions." Well, those of you who know me can probably guess my response to that. And it just turned off any interest that I had in spirituality, God, Judaism, because it seemed to me pretty obvious that they were just going through a formality. They were doing things because that's what they've always done, not because there was a deep underlying truth. And so that caused me to turn off and just go through the motions. And there were a lot of motions to go through because, as I said, I went through 5 years of Hebrew school, followed by bar mitzvah. And the entire time I lived with my parents, I obeyed my dad's rules because he said, "As long as you live in my house, you under my roof," I think were his exact words, "then you're going to obey my rules." And so that's what I did. And I went through all the motions of being Jewish, but I didn't believe anything. Instead, I found something else to believe in, and that substitute for me was science. I love science, in particular astronomy. And in fact, if you asked me at a young age, what profession are you going to choose, Harris, it would have been an astronomer. And so I believed in a scientific explanation for why things are the way they are, and was just trying to keep my parents off my back in terms of their requirements for me as long as I lived in their house. Now, as soon as I left and I went off to college, I completely let go of all those pretenses and I did absolutely nothing spiritual whatsoever because I simply was not interested. And it was at college, I went to Vassar College, that I met my wife, my first wife, Marilyn. And she too was Jewish. But we got along just fine when it came to the subject of spirituality, because while she believed in God, that belief didn't influence her life at all. And so whether you have Harris, who doesn't believe in anything, or Marilyn, who believes in God, but so what? It was really just, it continued to be a non issue in my life. I guess when we got married at 22, that was the last religious activity that I ever performed, the Jewish faith. It was very important to my parents that we had a big traditional Jewish wedding. And we did, and there were a couple of hundred people there, and it was had all the photos and all the fanfare and all the traditions. And after that, that was it. So, for those of you who know me today, it probably sounds a little bit strange for you to hear of me as a person who absolutely lacked any interest in spirituality. But that is where I was in my journey in my early 20s. I started out my career in Connecticut right after school. Marilyn we both applied to grad schools and we were accepted to different programs. So to stay together, I worked in Connecticut to put Marilyn through law school with the plan that when she finished, we would move to Virginia and she would work to put me through UVA, and I was enrolled in the business program. And I decided to do something that was very different. I got an idea for a game, and I quit my job after doing quite a bit of research. And I became a licensed developer for a little known company at the time. You may have heard of it today. That company is Apple. But at the time, Apple was a very small company, and I developed a piece of software for the Apple II computer called Portfolio. And I spent 2 years of my life writing Portfolio and then marketing Portfolio. And I'm going into a little bit of detail about this because this really is an important part of my spiritual journey. Up until this point in my life, I was very confident that I was going to be able to get whatever I sought in life just by sheer effort, talent, and drive. I was very motivated to succeed. And part of that is my Jewish heritage, but part of it also was my personality. And so when I started my company, not even knowing how to program, I figured I would teach myself how to program, and I did. And when Portfolio was released, it was reviewed in the biggest publications, and the largest software magazine in the world just published the most wonderful review of Portfolio in its Christmas edition, which I still have today. And I won't bore you with the details, but it ends with the line, "From beginning to end, it gleams with quality." And thus began a very exciting chapter of my life, as there were multiple times over a period of 2 years that I had good reason to believe that I would be financially set for life by my mid-20s. I signed a contract with the top software agent in the world, and he had gotten $20 million for his last client. And things were looking very good. And I had a computer manufacturer approach me and said that they wanted to bundle Portfolio with every one of their computers that they sold. And so there were many highs, but what I found out is there were also many lows. There were many devastating disappointments. And ultimately, after 2 years with Portfolio, I ended up walking away from it and going back to school. Now, it's an interesting journey in and of itself, but it's an important part of my spiritual journey because it was a very real world lesson to me that I could fail. And in fact, as I look back over the course of my life, I would say that failure was one of the most important things that's ever happened to me. If I had met with that much success at that young age, I think it would have ruined my character. That softened me. It caused me to look beyond myself for something bigger. And I didn't have long to wait. The first day of law school, actually, it wasn't even law school yet, it was just the orientation program. I sat on the very first row, which was in keeping with my personality, and I met another person who would also be inclined to sit on the first row. And that person would end up becoming my best friend. And his name is Jim. And Jim was a former Secret Service agent. And he had been in charge of Vice President Bush's security detail. And so he had some incredibly major responsibilities that he had taken care of. And he was a wonderful storyteller. So he had a lot of things to share with me, and I had some interesting stories to share with him, and we got along just great. We ended up being in the same small group together, as well as having all the same classes. So we really spent a lot of time together, but far and away the most important time that we spent was when Jim talked with me about spirituality. Now, I grew up in a very sheltered environment in the sense that it was virtually an all-Jewish community. And then I went from there to Vassar College, which was an extremely liberal arts college. And I certainly didn't meet any religious people there. And so Jim came from a Catholic background. Many of the people in his family were either nuns or priests, basically devoting their lives to God's service. But Jim had had a non-traditional Catholic experience. And he was the first person I ever met who told me that he had experienced having a relationship with God. Now, this is a concept that I had never encountered in Judaism. Judaism was basically something you did. It's you perform the mitzvahs to show that you're a good Jewish person. And essentially, that's what I thought the religion was. But Jim wasn't talking about me about ceremonies or things that you're supposed to do. He was talking about that it's possible to actually know God. And initially, I wasn't very interested in this at all. But I really liked Jim, and we had a great developing friendship. And so when he would bring the subject up, I would listen. Eventually, he got my attention by asking me questions about what I thought. And obviously, I had my own set of beliefs, and I explained to him how I thought that the world would be better off if there were no religion. And I shared with him my thoughts about scientific explanation of things. And Jim was exactly the right person for me to talk to at the time, because I would have walked away from anybody who was preachy, who was going to tell me, well, you need to do this, you need to think that. I simply would have had none of it. But instead, Jim engaged me intellectually. And we would talk things through, and he piqued my interest enough that I actually did something that I really don't recall doing in all my 5 years of Hebrew school. I picked up the Bible and started to read it, and was quite shocked by what I read. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be at all. And I talked this over with Jim, and basically we developed a very deep running conversation on the subject of spirituality that would span much of my time in law school. And during this first semester, I went from being completely hostile to any religion to being curious, wanting genuinely to know more. I still would have classified myself as an agnostic, but I was agnostic now who was willing to at least discuss the subject. And I thought that, okay, being agnostic is the right position because we can never know for sure. And one Sunday morning, I did something that in my entire life, I can assure you, I have never done up until then. And that was, wait for it, I turned on the TV. Now, you probably don't think that was very much after that big reveal. But for me as a Jewish person, that is an absolutely shocking thing to do. Because from the time I could talk, I had been taught you never turn on the TV on Sunday morning because it's going to be all these Christian shows, and you do not want to listen to a word of them. And so I literally had never turned on the TV on Sunday morning. Well, this particular morning I did, and I happened to be listening to the Hour of Power with Dr. Robert Schuller. And again, he was not what I was expecting a TV preacher to be. I expected to be lectured to and to be reprimanded and chastened and a few other verbs I probably didn't even know at that point. But he was nothing like that. Instead, he was very articulate, very witty, and he he drew me in. He got me to want to listen to what he had to say, and listen I did. And there was one thing in particular that I remember from that very first day that I watched his show. He said, if there's one group of people I don't understand, it's agnostics. And that really got my attention because at this point I was quite sure that being agnostic was the right thing to be. And here's a man who I am quickly learning to respect, who says they don't make any sense. So I wanted to hear the rest of the argument. And he said, well, he said, of course I understand believers. And he said, I also understand atheists. I don't agree with them, but I understand their position. They say is there is no God, and I say there is a God. And logically, there are two possibilities. Either there is a God or there isn't. Now, the atheist, if there is no God, well, the atheist will be right. Won't do him any good because he'll be without senses, he'll be dead and unable to appreciate his victory, but at least he'll have been right. Of course, if there is a God, then I'll be right because I'm a person of faith and I've lived my life believing that there is a God. And if there is a God, I'll spend eternity with him in heaven. But the person who can never be right is the agnostic. Because you see that either there is a God or there isn't. An atheist can be right, a believer can be right, an agnostic can never. And I found this logic inescapable. And it piqued my desire to figure out this puzzle and not to stay sitting on the fence and saying, well, we can never know. Now I really wanted to know even more. Well, it was about this time that Jim did something for me that really had a pronounced effect on my spiritual. He had taped, hour by hour, editing out the commercials. He had taped a miniseries called Jesus of Nazareth. And I had, this will probably really surprise some of you, I'm 20 at this point, 25 years old. I had never once in my life heard the gospel. 25 years old in America, I'd never heard it because that's how insulated I was from it. And Jim lent that miniseries to me, and Marilyn and I watched it one weekend. And we were both profoundly moved by what we saw. And afterwards, we said to one another, I really believe that that happened. In other words, this is historically true. Obviously, these are actors and they're giving a portrayal of characters, but that the events that are being described here, they really did occur. And this was an enormous step for me in terms of my spiritual progression, because up until that point, I really would have had nothing positive to say about Jesus at all. I knew nothing of Jesus, only that I'd been told to use his name exclusively as a curse, never for any other purpose. That's what I was raised with. So to go from that to saying, I believe that that did happen, was an amazing leap forward. But you could say that this was head knowledge, not heart knowledge, because even though I now said that that's what I thought historically happened, it was still just history to me. It didn't have any profound impact on my daily life. So Marilyn and I were living in Charlottesville, Virginia at the time. And I need to backtrack just a little bit here to fill up another part of the story that now becomes relevant. When Marilyn and I got married, she was a smoker. And she promised when we got married that she would quit, and she did. And you may have heard it said that ex-smokers are the worst around smoking. Well, Marilyn developed a real sensitivity to cigarette smoke. She hated it. And when we lived in New England, it really was not a problem because not too many people smoked where we were. But when I moved to go to UVA and was living now in the South, a lot more people smoked. And it really started to have a physical effect on Marilyn. And she began to get headaches when she was around cigarette smoke. Now, this continued for that first year that we were there. And by the end of the first year, it had gotten really severe to the point where we had gone to every doctor that you could go to. And she was under a number of doctors' cares. She was still functioning, but she was basically just hanging on. And we were counting the days until we could leave Virginia because it was just a terrible situation for her. So I entered my second year of law school. And one of the things you do in your second year is you have the opportunity to interview with law firms that you could go clerk for in the summer. It's kind of an audition to see if you like them, if they like you. And if so, that you can work there for the summer or part of the summer. And then they make you an offer, you can go work there for your real job. So in my second year, I interviewed with a variety of different firms, and one of them was located in Orlando, Florida. And so that kind of catches us up. I'm now in my second year. Jen and I continue to have lunches together. And actually, one of them had a very special moment in it that I'll share with you. We were walking back from the kind of the mess hall. It's the on campus place where the meals are included with your tuition. And we were just talking casually. And I don't remember what the subject was, but here's what I remember verbatim. Jim is talking and he says, Harris, you never know. It could be that the entire reason I'm here at University of Virginia Law School is to have these lunches with you. And when he said those words, I don't think I'd ever had this effect before. It's kind of like the ring of truth. We both just stopped in our tracks and we turned and we looked at one another. And in that moment, we both knew that that was exactly what was going to happen. And in fact, Jim was too disabled. He went to school because he was disabled in the job, and he ultimately ended up being too disabled to be able to have a career as a lawyer. And so he never made a dime practicing law after 3 years of law school. The reason God had him go to University of Virginia Law School was so he could sit next to me that first day of orientation, become my friend, have all those wonderful lunches with me, and speak into my life the truth about God. So Jim and I continue our friendship in the second year of law school, and I start getting ready for the potential to be able to earn some money, which suddenly became very important because there was a major change in my second year. Marilyn's condition deteriorated to the point where she could no longer hold it. Her migraine headaches had gone from occasional to frequent to almost nonstop. Just daylight, would trigger excruciating pain for her. And it got to where she literally became an invalid. And this became, for us as a couple, a huge financial challenge because the agreement was I would work to put her through law school, and then she would turn around and put me through school. I'd planned on doing a joint degree, MBA JD. I ended up cutting it just to 3 years to just do the law. But even so, we had a year and a half to go with no more income. And as you can imagine, we very quickly went through our savings. So when the second semester was ending, we were really in a very precarious position financially. I went off to Orlando by myself. Marilyn was far too sick to be able to travel. And so her mom was going to take a train down from Connecticut and live with her and take care of her while I was clerking for 6 weeks in Orlando. During this time, in between my departure and her mom's arrival, there was a period that Marilyn was all alone. And if you've ever heard the phrase rock bottom, for her, this was a rock bottom. Her life had a lot of promise. She was class valedictorian in high school, and she had so much potential. And here, now, she couldn't work at all. The doctors had really exhausted all the alternatives they could come up with. All they could do was drug her and try to minimize or lessen the pain to where it was bearable. We really didn't have any procedures left for them to try. We did do procedures, nothing worked. And so she's looking at a very short remainder of her life. I should mention she dropped from about 130 pounds to 92 pounds. When I tell you that she was horrifically incapacitated, I'm not exaggerating. The doctors said, you need to have your affairs in order because it's going to be measured in months, the amount of time we expect you to live with the severity of your condition. And we never did get a name for it. It was most similar to epilepsy, but it wasn't epilepsy. It was like seizures in her head. And they just could not treat it. So she is alone now. Our finances gone. No job, no prospects for anything other than pain or death. And she's just sobbing. And while she's on the floor crying, she remembers something that she heard Dr. Schuler say on one of those shows that we watch. And he said, the most important thing in life is to have your priorities in life straight. God first, family second, work third. And Marilyn knew she had never done that. She had never made God a priority in her life. She said she believed that that was so, but she didn't really mean anything by it. Well, in this hour, she did mean it. And she, from the bottom of her heart, she uttered these words. She said, God, whatever is left of my life, I give to you. And she just stood up. And it took a moment for her to realize it. But the pain was gone. So she started moving around. Still no pain. She turned on a light, full brightness, no pain. She was completely healed of something that literally was going to kill her. Now, you can imagine her astonishment, because while we had seen testimonies on the Hour of Power of people who would tell about miraculous things that God had done in their lives, from our Jewish backgrounds, there are no such things as modern-day miracles. They don't occur. There was really nothing in our heritage to prepare us for this possibility that God would miraculously intervene in her circumstance. And so she was dancing around with joy. She wanted to run out onto the balcony and scream, I've been healed, because she was just so happy to not be in pain. But there was a problem. I'm in Orlando, which is probably close to 1,000 miles away. She can't tell me. We're too poor for me to get a phone. I don't have a phone in Orlando. And so she writes me a letter. And one day I pick up the letter and I get this message, I've been healed, 40 exclamation points. Well, being who I was at the time, I came to the only reasonable conclusion I could, and that is that a human mind can only bear so much pain before it snaps. She's lost it. She thinks she's been healed. This, of course, I know that that doesn't happen in real life. That's something you read about in the Bible, or, that doesn't actually happen to real people. And so it wasn't until she flew down and I met with her that I realized this isn't some act some brave, front that she's putting on. This is real. God has miraculously healed her of something that really was a death sentence. And so, confronted with this evidence, how could I not believe in God? Because there was no other explanation. Indeed, the miracle was so great that I know of two other people who, learning of the miracle, seeing it happen, actually became Christians as a result, one of which was her mom, because it was such an amazing transformation to go from death's door to completely well again. And the doctors had no explanation. They just didn't know anything about it. But it was a permanent healing that never came back. So that was a really important part of my spiritual journey. It wasn't all of it. I still had to deal with the question of Jesus. And so did Marilyn, because when she prayed to God. And as a Jew, one of the most deeply imprinted concepts in your life is that there's one God. And so, who can Jesus be? You can't have three gods: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And so, we had to figure that out. And it took a little bit of time for us to work through that. But in time, we did. And initially, it helped calling him Yeshua, because if that was his real name. No one ever in Jesus' life called him Jesus. That wasn't his name. His name was Yeshua. And using the Hebrew name Yeshua helped a lot for us to get over that cultural block that we had to Jesus. Now, those of you who know me today can attest that I don't have any problem using the name Jesus. But initially, that was hard for me. So, over the course of that next year, I started going to church up in Charlottesville, and then finally, when we moved down to Orlando and I accepted that job with the place I clerked, we started our time at Calvary Assembly, which is where we went for about 5 years. And that's really where I got my start in Christian service. Since then, I've gone to churches of quite a few different denominations. If you ask me what denomination I am, I'll say I'm really not any. I just follow Jesus. So that is how I came from being a good Jewish agnostic to someone who preaches at Christian churches. Most of all, I want to thank God, because he did something truly miraculous to get my attention. He was very patient with me, and he could have easily let me die in the condition I was in, and he would have said, "Boy, I gave you every opportunity and you just didn't listen." But instead, he did a modern day miracle to show me that he was real. And that's really quite extraordinary. And I pray that I'm able to share with other people what a wonderful God he is.